Good morning. Thank you. I'm Milton Adams, Senior Vice Provost at the University of Virginia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Today's forum focuses on basic human rights for women and girls in the Middle East and builds on a series of recent events at the university exploring the intrinsic value of civil society, what it means to be truly free. This summer, UVA, in conjunction with the Presidential Precinct, hosted 25 young emerging leaders from Africa who are building democratic institutions in their own communities. Last week, University President Terry Sullivan dedicated a portion of our university cemetery that included 67 unmarked graves, a painful reminder of these African Americans enslaved at Thomas Jefferson's University, many of whom helped build the university's original buildings, a World Heritage Site. Today, we have the honor to sponsor with AMAR, the Presidential Precinct, Morven, and the UVA Lynn Women's Center, another provocative program responding to ISIS and attack on women and girls. Program planners have assembled a remarkable cast of senior policy experts, faculty, and practitioners to lead this conversation. Sponsors have also invited student participants, bringing fresh ideas and new questions to the dialogue. Precisely what a strong public university should do. Like most of our students, I am not an expert on terrorism, but like many citizens across this country and around the world, I'm stunned by the incomprehensible violence unleashed against innocent populations. My brief comments this morning are not those of a scholar with a specialty in the Middle East, but rather those from a member of the university community who has watched tragedy unfold in that region and wondered how we might help. These are my very basic questions for your consideration. First, how is a terrorist organization managed to march across and occupy a significant portion of Iraq, execute thousands of people, imprison scores of women, and sell girls into bondage? After the U.S. spent more than a decade on the ground with much loss of American and Iraqi lives, what went so terribly wrong? Would stronger civil institutions have made a difference? Did the failure of Iraq's government to create a climate of inclusion contribute to the rise of this radical group? Perhaps both. We'll hear from experts today on their conclusions. Second, what about nations like Syria, where the U.S. has decided not to intervene to the same extent, even in the face of mass murder of civilian populations? What is being done to address their humanitarian needs? Third, what are the specific needs of communities that do stand up to ISIS or other brutal regimes? What can be done to support them? I cannot imagine the daily life of fathers and mothers in towns across Iraq and in neighboring countries who have decided to leave all they know and all they own or risk being captured and killed. Ladies and gentlemen, what community does not prize its young people, especially women, and know the devastating heartache when one of them is abducted? Here in Charlottesville, we know the pain when one young student is killed. It's almost impossible to grasp that that nightmare could unfold every day in every neighborhood and communities across the region. Fourth, who provides an accurate accounting of what is happening on the ground? First-hand news reports seem all too difficult, and in-depth coverage essentially impossible. There are too few reporters in refugee camps revealing the scope of the humanitarian crisis. As hundreds of thousands leave their homeland, who is there to tell their story? Perhaps the decision by ISIS to target journalists has had an impact on these organizations. Experts may again suggest an answer. I do know that we are delighted that AMAR has made it possible for two remarkable women who are part of their team in Erbil to join us today. They have literally come from the front and can provide firsthand accounts directly from the field. Mrs. Behar and Dr. Bayan, thank you so much for making the long journey. We are eager to hear your story. Finally, we need to celebrate what is going on in the midst of this crisis. We need to recognize the role of amazing women who are leading by example in their communities, not as victims but heroes. And we need to support those organizations that support them. While many NGOs are departing the chaos, others like AMAR are staying the course. This is their territory and has been their home for almost 25 years. They know what works and are working around the clock to lift up what is good and right and courageous. They are about changing lives for thousands of women and girls and their families, and they have done just that. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce Baroness Nicholson. The determination and success of AMAR is a direct reflection of its leader, Emma Nicholson, who is no stranger to the Middle East and North Africa, where her work has made an enormous difference. Baroness Nicholson has successfully led one of the most remarkable nonprofit programs in the region, delivering healthcare and education to those most in need. Through her leadership, AMAR has a strong reputation for programs where overhead is low, impact is high, and results are long-lasting. Recently appointed UK Trade Envoy by Prime Minister David Cameron, and most importantly for us, our keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Baroness Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Adams. I'm most grateful to you for that kind introduction. It's my very great pleasure today to introduce you to the AMAR Foundation. We are a registered NGO in Washington, a registered NGO in London, a registered NGO in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and just to be registered, inshallah, in Somalia. Our purpose is the building of democratic institutions under the rule of law, and we present ourselves as achieving this through the provision of essential health and education services, and moving on from there, jobs and futures. Why is this different from any other well-meaning and highly effective NGO? Perhaps we have a few differences that you will see today, and one of the most important differences is that we focus essentially on capacity building, training, and institution building. Perhaps that differentiates us, as you will see today. We have a little short video, just 4 minutes, to give you an overview. colleagues, a reminder of reality. The family is the basic unit of society. It is therefore the unit of society that dictatorships attack. If you have the family against you, then you will have the community against you. If you can destroy the family in some way or another, then you fragment communities completely, and tribes and cultures go with that. That is why ISIL has been so deliberately destroying the family unit. What is the heart of the family unit? Generally speaking, it is the mother. And I'm now going to show you, just for a few minutes, pictures of some of the women whose families have been destroyed, whose daughters have been led into the marketplace and sold as slaves in Mosul city, and also in Syria, and I believe elsewhere. Some of whose daughters have been kept trapped inside Mosul city as hostages, being moved around every other night or so in small groups to be hidden in different buildings. And some of whose sons, many of whose sons, husbands, and the fathers of their children have been shot out of hand. AMAR works extensively in Iraq. And Angus Beaton and I, our colleague over there who took these pictures, we visited the whole of Iraq recently, and we do so very regularly indeed. And these little arrows show you where AMAR is working and where we went to see the IDPs. The IDPs, of course, are everywhere. 1.4 million people have been driven out of Mosul city, the Nineveh plain, and so on. And the suffering is tragic. Right down to Basra, AMAR is working in every single governorate except one. There are 18. We're not in Anbar province at the moment. Struggling all the way since the day after the invasion on the 9th of June to try to stem the tide of human misery. Later, for the whole of the rest of the later of today, we're going to be focusing on the assaults on women and girls. But just for a moment, think about the whole country. Kanka camp is in the north, and it's just outside Dohuk, in the Dohuk governorate. And here we have a huge collection of Yazidi people. The Yazidis follow a different faith, older than Zoroastrianism, really ancient into the mists of time, which is barely, if at all, written down. It is practiced by ritual, it is practiced by prayer, it is practiced by word of mouth, and it is a huge, intricate, detailed, peaceful culture. And these dear people, there are about 300,000 of them now, around the small town of Kanka. And all of these ladies have lost their families. This dear little baby was born on the way. Do you recall that they were driven up a mountain with rockets and bombs following them? One poor small boy told me that his entire family had been wiped out because he was working a little bit quicker than the others. And the whole lot, these 10, were struck by a weapon. All fell down. These girls were begging me for education. They were about to take their exams when all of this happened. These ladies wearing traditional Yazidi clothing, they have to wear in their families what the mother makes, and it's that traditional clothing. So Kanka camp, as you can see, these dismal dwellings, just simple tents put up by UNHCR, but the world is not reacting. The big donors are not coming forward. It is not seen in the light of the top-level emergency that the United Nations has declared it to be. So whereas the great gatherings, such as the gathering for Gaza, which allowed, I think, $4 billion to be set aside, this is not happening for the 1.4 million IDPs that have been driven around in Iraq. AMAR is putting up a health centre here. I hope that we will be able to support about 50,000 people with our health centre. I believe we probably will be. We have a lot of experience of this. The cruelty that has been meted out to the Yazidis is beyond belief. And how to assist these poor women and girls when their lives have been worse than destroyed, their families taken away from them. In their hearts and minds, they can't even think of anything else, and how could they? I met one lady who can't even speak. She's been unable to speak since she watched her 2 sons being driven away in a lorry to certain death. She can't say anything at all. In Erbil City, last time I was there 3 weeks ago, I was told there were 197,000 urban squatters. This is a whole great block of Christians who are being looked after by the Chaldean Catholic Church opposite, supported by the Catholic churches globally, which is absolutely wonderful. But look at the setting in which they're living, what looks like a half-built car park, extremely dangerous. UNHCR has kindly given some screenings, not enough, just a little. Volunteers come in every day with food. These 2 girls also, they brought their books with them, but again, they're desperate. They would have been doing their exams the very week that their lives were destroyed. Another little family, absolutely. Look how they're living on concrete floor with concrete blocks behind them. Then there's another block of people who are also Christians, the Assyrian Christians. Prince Charles is patron of the AMAR Foundation, and he sent me a check, asked me specifically, because he was so worried about the Christians, this time to give his gift to the Christians. He's incredibly generous, he gives all at the time. And this was for a little Christian group. So I went to the Assyrian Christians, and we assembled some things, exactly right. I felt Prince Charles' mind's very much about mothers and babies. So we assembled things like babies' nappies and so on and so forth, and gave them out in the name of Prince Charles. Even in such a tragic situation, there was humour. When I told the assembled company that this was from Prince Charles, a little question came, how is Princess Diana? So that was a difficult one for me to answer. So I moved straight on to his new coming grandchild through the Duchess of Cambridge. But you can see these people, again, are Christians. You've seen the Yazidis, 2 different blocks of Christians. But you know that all other ethnic minorities, including the Shia, including the Sunni, you will find them all. Look at that poor lady, her life destroyed, utter suffering in her face. Behaka camp, just outside Erbil, where our colleagues have been incredibly busy. We've rebuilt the health centre, or rather made it available to be done again as a health centre, including all sorts of things. Another 3,000 to 5,000 people living here. And very, very, very simple health cover before proper funding came through, which we're not doing. And again, a huge number of people with very, very little indeed. A big camp, but only about 5,000, whereas the Yazidi block, including the squatters who can't come into the camp, are about 300,000. I don't know how I would be able to survive as a woman in this situation, with perhaps a few remaining children who hadn't been killed, or perhaps a family relation, perhaps somebody elderly. That little girl, who should be doing something constructive with education, was doing nothing but finding bits of wood to make guns, because that's all she can think of at the moment. So, utterly tragic situation. You can see the bleak hopelessness in people's faces. Making some bread, I think. The United Nations has hardly come forward. It's very hard to know why, because they do have funding. But for some reason, that funding is not coming through. We put forward a big application with their full partnership, but they have not yet responded, and that was 2 or 3 months ago. And this was a project that they actually wanted to happen for women in the camps. Went to Najaf, which is the holiest shrine for the Shia, and had the opportunity to enter the holy shrine for a few minutes, which was wonderful, and speak to the deputy governor, who's also a friend. He's chairman of the Najaf Chamber of Commerce. And he and his friends have organized a most massive effort. There are about 82,000 people living along a 30-kilometer highway outside the holy shrine. There are all sorts of people, Shia, Sunni, Christians, all of whom fled from the horrors in Mosul, all of whom did not manage to get their families out intact with them. Very sick people. That poor old lady had been walking for 10 days and could barely move again. We got her immediately into emergency hospital, and we then managed emergency medicine, and we're putting in a big health centre down there as well. You can tell, therefore, the vastness of the problem that has struck Iraq, with 1/3 of its territory taken by ISIL, with a huge number of the population destroyed by ISIL. And in a sense, like Churchill's little platoons, the AMAR Foundation, we've stretched every nerve we possibly can to do everything we can to help everyone. I believe that almost the worst hit are the women and girls, for the reasons that you will hear later, and then you will learn what we are doing to try to tackle it. AMAR runs on about $2 million a year only, so that's why we feel that our work should be much better known, and we should be able to obtain much more support. We stretch the dollars so far that it's almost invisible. Thank you. I now, leaving you with those thoughts, which are the backdrop to the deliberations of today, I have the greatest possible pleasure in introducing a hugely eminent lady, originally, I think, from Iran, Dr. Haile Yasfandari. I worked a lot in Iran for about 14 or 15 years as a volunteer in order to support the Iraqi refugees in all of the camps, on the border and across the border, and then the other side of Iran, at Madan, in order to help the Afghanistani refugees. I have the highest possible opinion of the Iranian people. I'm sorry to say I don't have that same opinion of Iranian politicians, but that's very different indeed. But I want to thank her very, very, very much indeed for her bravery under stress in prison in Iran. I mean, I don't know how you managed it. Here you are, up and running and shining, and fantastic leader, working out of your organization on the Middle East again. And I'm really, really honored. We're really honored to have you with us today. You're a real, real star. Thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this meeting. Thank you very much, Baroness Nicholson. You made my day, and I'm sure my colleague today, who is a Professor Milani at the University of Virginia, by saying that you have very fond memories and impression from Iran. It's ironic that we should be meeting to consider yet another instance of violence against women just when we are marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. It was at the Fourth World Conference on Women which resulted in the Beijing Declaration that Mrs. Clinton said, if there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, it is that human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. These words were echoed by women around the world, They became the basis of many changes in the status of women and resulted in 7 UN resolutions, including Resolution 1325 on peace and security. Yet, since Beijing, atrocities against women continue. Despite all our efforts, violence against women in time of war continue. Women's bodies are considered spoils of war and trophies for the conquerors, and the violence occurs even in the time of peace. Today, as Baroness Nicholson described, in Syria and Iraq, under the shadow of a ragtag fighters who represent ISIS or the so-called Islamic State, we are witnessing unspeakable brutalities against women, girls, and children. These are women and girls who, until yesterday, were leading normal lives in their towns and cities. The girls went to schools and definitely didn't make guns. They probably made dolls. The women were homemakers or breadwinners for their families. Many of these women had already endured years of travail and hardship. Iraqi women were just recovering from a decade and more of war, boycotts, and factional fightings. Syrian women were coping with 3 years of civil war, flight, homelessness, and refugee status. Now comes the plague of the Islamic State. Astonishingly, despite the alarm raised in neighboring Arab countries and the West by the rapid territorial gains of ISIS and the threat this posed to regional stability, few paid attention to the treatment of women in ISIS-occupied territories. Yet we had here, for all the world to see, makeshift slave markets, rape, reward to the victorious warriors in the form of brothels and marriage without consent to little girls, and young women, and the kidnapping of women, and the demand for ransom. Everywhere, the pattern is the same. Once a town falls into ISIS's hand, women and girls are separated from their families, and the young are separated from the old. ISIS men then proceed with their work. In ISIS-occupied towns in Iraq, there were reports of obligatory female genital mutilation, eventually denied, and of forcing professional women to give up their jobs. Just 2 weeks ago, to set an example, 4 professional women, a lawyer, 2 doctors, and an activist were executed. Women of the Yazidi sect, an amalgam of Zoroastrianism and Sufism, have been a particular target of ISIS abuse. We saw a series of pictures of them. To the men of ISIS, Yazidis are infidels. Therefore, they can do with the women whatever they wish, rape them with impunity, or sell them off as sex slaves. To justify their abominable treatment of women, the men of ISIS have taken to citing surahs of the Quran, as they did on their online magazine, Dabiq, 2 weeks ago. In their interpretation of Quranic ordinances, women who fall into their hands are the spoils of war. They can be raped, taken as concubines, or married without consent. Where it comes to treatment of women, ISIS is not a movement with which one can reason. It cannot be put to shame by public exposure of its atrocities. Doesn't understand what the word shame means. On the contrary, ISIS is proud to publicize its barbarianism for all the world to see. I believe ISIS has to be defeated. ISIS is an armed military force, and military action against it is necessary. As many others have observed, the US and the European can send aircraft against ISIS, but air action against ISIS, critical as it is, will not be enough. ISIS has to be fought on the ground, but sending ground forces is really the job of Turkey and the Arab states, not the US and its European allies. The regional countries must awaken to the fact that this is their fight. ISIS poses a threat to their stability, to their mothers, to their sisters, to their brothers, to their daughters, and to their well-being. They cannot only look to the West to do their work for them. But the defeat of ISIS cannot be achieved on the military battlefield alone. It has also to be defeated on the battlefield of ideas. It is incumbent on Arab and Muslim governments and the Islamic clerical community and on the Arab and Muslim intelligentsia to condemn ISIS's treatment of women. The time for cautious language on the women's issues, fear of treading on imaginary Muslim sensibilities is long over. True, in September, 120 Arab Muslim scholars condemned the atrocities of ISIS, including their treatment of women. But one statement is not enough. Arab and Muslim governments and the intelligentsia, academics, writers, artists, politicians need to engage in a sustained campaign to make clear that the treatment of women and girls by ISIS has no place in today's world. The Muslim clerical hierarchy and the scholars of Islam have a particularly heavy responsibility in this regard. The senior clergy, scholars in centers of learning such as Al-Azhar in Egypt, Zaytuna in Tunisia, and similar institutions in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Muslim world speak to a following. They are the authorities of Islam. Their word carry weight with the mass of believers. They need to make clear that in the 21st century, Islam does not and cannot condone concubinage, rape, treatment of women as spoils of war, non-consensual marriage, violence against women. They need to win the heart and mind to the enlightened interpretation of Islam and represent the best in current Islamic scholarly thoughts. I've said that fighting ISIS on the ground and in the battlefield of ideas is primarily the responsibility of the regional states and the Islamic world as a whole. But we in the West have a responsibility too. As ISIS is defeated and pushed out of towns and cities, we need to work with local civil society organizations to help women and girls who were scarred by the ISIS experience should be helped. We need to take care of the women and their children to find ways to help reintegrate women who are certain to face the risk of ostracism into their societies, to help local communities provide these women with homes, counseling, and jobs, something that AMAR has been doing and will continue to do. This, of course, will require working with local governments. We saw Baroness Nicholson talking to the governor of Najaf. You need their help to be able to achieve what you want. We need to work with civil society organizations on the ground and also with the clerical community. The since ISIS is committing these atrocities against women in the name of religion, it is the duty, as I said earlier, of the clerical community to teach the communities to treat abused women with compassion and respect rather than turning their back to them and ostracizing them. Let me end my remarks by reiterating that no civil society organization in Iraq or Syria can do this on its own. I believe we need our civil societies in the West, but we also need one country in the West in cooperation with one of the regional countries to take the lead in mounting this international effort. Thank you.